most non-serious subject for a lot of people, because a lot of people say that environmental law lacks credibility, lacks implementation. There are a lot of issues around it. It has a lot to do about activism, but rather on paper, in practice, environmental law doesn't play a very important role. But these are the nonsensical myths which we usually base our arguments and our likeliness for subject also concerned. So it all started with a personal note that I completed my master's in constitutional law, had no relevance whatsoever or connection with environmental law. Thought of one of the issues when I was there in Chennai, and one of the pressing issues at that point in time was Kaveri. So it did influence a lot, and I thought, let's try a hand at practicing at one of the most cleanest tribunal. Cleanest in the sense, it had a very good work culture at that point in time. So I thought, let's start practicing and probably working under the chairmanship of Justice A.K. Goyal. So I was a law clerk at that point in time, got selected, and then I started working him. And to my amazement, the kind of exposure that environmental law brought has actually made turned my life upside down. I'm a full-time faculty who teaches environmental law, public international law, and I'm about to complete my research on environmental law. So that's the impact of the subject on me. Now, personal from the personal note to the topic that we have at hand today, that is transboundary water conflicts and climate change. Now, this is a very interesting, very exhaustive, and this topic requires a lot of thorough reading. So this is a disclaimer that I would give before boiling it down and breaking it down for you in easy terms. Now, we all know the fact that, we have the Indian Constitution. Let's start with the basics. So, when we look at the Indian Constitution, there is no word environment per se in the Constitution that is there. So, the word environment is completely not found per se or on a prima facie reading of a Constitution of India. But when we interpret the Constitution, when we see a lot of progressive judgment, we see the word environment, or rather, let's say the concepts revolving environment being, included into, or let's say married into the Constitution. So judiciary has definitely played a very important role. Now, one of the most strongest article in the Indian Constitution, which I personally account for apart from 32 and 226, is Article 253. Now, 253 plays a very important role because 253 talks about international obligations that we have. It talks about treaties, agreements, which India signs in the national capacity, and probably also tries to, have laws which could be translated as per the needs of the nation. So 253 is a very strong article in the Indian Constitution, plays and rather bridges up the gap between international commitments that we or treaties that we sign at international level, and finally translate into the law that we have at the national level. So the marrying of national and international laws, frameworks, policies happen through 253. Now, 253 is another very important article. We have various other entries also in the Constitution when we look at, which talks about such provisions whereby international commitments are actually fulfilled, and national laws are framed in tune with the national laws and policies, whereby committing to the goals that we already have. Now, in light of all of this, whatever I said, one of the most interesting things that we're hearing right now, and you people might also be hearing about, is National Education Policy, NEP, recently. And this has been creating a lot of issues for a lot of teachers like us and students like you, thinking we are all thinking, where are we going ahead, and what is the structure that we're going to follow, because multiple entry, exit point, there are many things that are there. Parallel, you might be also hearing something called as SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. Now, Sustainable Development Goals 2030 is the commitment that countries like us, both developing and developed nations, have actually signed to or agreed to fulfill by the year 2030. Now, 2030, we've committed that we will, reduce many things, include many things, green policies, so on and so forth. Now, a reality check that happened for all of us was the COP26 that took place recently. Now, COP26 that took place in Egypt, and the IPCC report, that is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Now, this IPCC report coupled with the COP26 proceedings that happened in Sheikh Al Sharm in Egypt, have actually opened the eyes of many countries. And to the extent where people are talking about, going carbon neutral, talking about renewable resources, reframing public policies and also laws within their nation, to the extent of talking about climate change. Now, the recent judgment that came up in Supreme Court, we just saw 2 3 days before. So one of the most very interesting judgments that came up, this was a particular judgment which, interestingly, I was also working upon when we were at the NGT. So this matter went through the NGT to the Supreme Court. So I remember 2017-18 when I was working at the NGT, we were actually looking at one of the issues of Great Indian Bustard and the laying down of the cables in the central India and how it was influencing the population of this very particular bird. Same issue we saw with the crocodiles in when the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel's statue was being, put up, and similarly the dolphins in the river Ganga. Now, these issues that have been coming up time and again, have highlighted how crucial it has become to incorporate law and policy by centering climate change, by centering nature at the epicenter and keeping humans at the periphery. Because one thing we have to be very clear, most of the laws that we have in India are anthropocentric. When we say anthropocentric, we mean they are human oriented, where you've kept human needs at the nucleus of, let's say, legal drafting. You feel, okay, the receiving end or the people who will get hurt by climate change would be humans. That's how we perceive our idea of climate change. But sadly, one thing we've forgotten is at the receiving end, there are other things also. It's nature itself, it's the flora, the fauna, etc. Many things are there. So most of our laws, not only in India, apart from India, outside world also, are anthropocentric. And when we use the word anthropocentric, anthro means human oriented, where you place human at the epicenter, whereas other things can be at the periphery. Now, this approach has caused a lot of problem. How has it caused a lot of problem? It has caused a lot of problem because we've failed to recognize, let's say, mutual existence of other species that are there. Very, interestingly, we can say even negating the whole idea of flora fauna existing with us. Now, all of this brings us to a very interesting point, and that point is that how do we then approach laws that are already there? So this is one question that we have, and this is the question which we'll keep in mind, and probably towards the end we will discuss. So much of the laws are anthropocentric. Now, interestingly, one of the most pressing issues around the world has been about allocation of water, distribution of water, and maybe also sharing of water. Now, sharing of water has been a very difficult and a most controversial issue, or all civilizations for that matter. Now, there's a very interesting chart if you people are interested in doing something on water law, because this is my area of interest. And probably if you want to go for an LLM in environmental law, Vanderbilt University, or anywhere for that matter, I urge you to read one very interesting chart. It is called as the Water Conflict Chronology. Worldwater.org is the website, if you can go and check. So it categorizes into 3 categories, starting and ranging from 2500 BC till today. How many conflicts have been there? So approximately all over the world, there has been 1634 water conflicts that have taken place. And a lot of these conflicts included weapons. A lot of these conflicts included human life losses. A lot of these conflicts used violence as a mode of achieving ends. And very interestingly, when we come to India, approximately there has been 260 conflicts in India, in and around India, rather I could say, or South Asia, if to safely put it up, which included weaponization, violence as a mode of actually finding its way to water conflicts. Now, when we're talking about water conflicts, we need to understand there are 2-3 categories that we are dealing with. Number one is groundwater, which we are not discussing today. That's a separate issue altogether. The other one would be artificial aquifers or natural aquifers. We are talking here about rivers, number one, that is flowing on the land, crossing one boundary to another. That's why we call it transboundary water sharing. So here, first disclaimer, we are not looking at all types of waters that we're talking about or water bodies that we're talking about. We are talking in very specific about transboundary water sharing. Now, the moment transboundary water sharing comes into picture, definitely a jurisdictional issue comes into picture. So we are not talking about only Indian jurisdiction here. We are talking about extraterritorial jurisdiction. Now, the moment we talk about extraterritorial jurisdiction or extraterritorial operation, in the Constitution, how it is referred in Article 245, also when we see Clause 1 and Clause 2, it talks about, it uses the word extraterritorial operation. So here, since extraterritorial operation comes into picture, so more than one jurisdiction come into picture. The biggest issue being that India shares its boundary with a lot of countries in and around. We have India and Bangladesh into picture. We have India and Pakistan into picture. We have India and Bhutan, India and Nepal, and also India and China for that matter. So as far as transboundary water sharing is concerned, the basic law, or rather, I would say the basic convention that describes or talks about, is the United Nations Convention on the Law of Non-Navigational Uses of International Water Courses. Now, short form, cutting it short, it is called as the UN Water Courses Convention. Now, this UN Water Courses Convention, it's a very comprehensive document. It's a charter which talks about the administration of transboundary water sources, and it also talks about the principle of allocation, cooperation, and environmental protection. Now, before we understand this, we need to understand one very basic concept. That basic concept is called riparian rights. Now, riparian rights even exist within India and outside India. So, I'll give you a very short example within India, and then we'll go back to international law. Let's say we share a river, that is, let's say the river Ganges is there, which flows through the mountains, through Himachal Pradesh to Uttarakhand, maybe also coming down to Uttar Pradesh and Delhi. We see that the starting point of the river is somewhere else and the ending point is somewhere else. So this bifurcates the land that is there. Yes, it bifurcates the land and the rights into two categories of rights. That is lower riparian rights and upper riparian rights. So riparian rights are basically those rights which govern or talk about and bifurcate as per the flow of the water of the river. So for example, if you're an upstream state or an upstream nation, you enjoy different set of rights. But when you are a downstream state, or when you are at a lower strata geographically placed, then you have different set of rights. We call it the downstream riparian rights. So riparian rights are nothing. These are bundle of rights that are being given to the beneficiaries, to the people, merely on the geographical location where they are placed. So let's say Himachal Pradesh in India, I'm just giving you a plain example here, could be an upper riparian state in our case. And let's say Delhi or Uttar Pradesh for that matter could be a lower riparian state. Now your question would be, ma'am, how does it affect anything for that matter? Yes, it does affect. Number one, it affects the water quality. It affects the water quantity. It affects the beneficiary rights. It also affects on a bundle of other rights which you can imagine and think of. I'm just giving you a few examples. Now, draw a parallel at the international level. At the international level, similarly, you have the same set of riparian rights. Some country will be placed at a higher pedestal or geographically at a higher platform, or let's say the river is emanating from that particular country. Let's say China for that matter. There is a river emanating from China entering into India. So China is an upper stream or upstream nation, upper riparian nation in this particular case, and India becomes a lower riparian nation. Similarly, when the river moves from India to Bangladesh, that particular position, India becomes an upper riparian nation and Bangladesh becomes a lower riparian nation. And this gives, or this talks about the power of negotiation whenever you're entering into a treaty. The upper riparian states have a much more say when it comes to negotiating a treaty related to water sharing or sharing of water resources on transboundary basis. So this is why the very basis we have to be clear is, whenever we see any conflict taking place or any issue taking place, first we need to understand is what position that country is coming from, whether that country is an upper riparian nation or a lower riparian nation. Then it also talks about what kind of or how much bargaining authority you have. So basically, these are certain kinds of rights, riparian rights, I'm repeating again, which are demarcated because of your geographical location, you being positioned at a higher altitude from where the river is emanating and flowing parallelly to a lower altitude geographically. Let's say I give you an example of Himachal Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. In this case, since river Ganges is flowing assumably from Himachal Pradesh to Uttar Pradesh, so Himachal Pradesh would be considered as an upper riparian nation. Uttar Pradesh would definitely be considered as a lower riparian nation. And this also decides on the quality of water. Now imagine, of course, the water is flowing from Himachal Pradesh, you're using it, the quantity and the quality would also differ the moment it reaches Uttar Pradesh. Maybe even the pollution level would rise, the freshness of the water in Himachal Pradesh would be much fresher, and what we receive in Uttar Pradesh would be very different. So similarly, there are various other things that are there. Now imagine a state which is upper riparian decides to build a dam. They say the river is emanating from my place and I want to build a dam because I probably want to have electricity produced. Now this definitely will increase or decrease the pressure on the lower riparian states. Why? Because you're bridging up or you're creating an artificial embankment of the river. So let's say overflow is there, definitely lower riparian nations will suffer. Let's say deficiency of water is there, definitely the lower riparian nation suffers. And such is exactly the case between India and Pakistan when it comes to Indus Water Treaty. So once we understand riparian nations, we move ahead and we understand what are the kinds of laws that are there. So if we go historically a little back in time, the first model law that is there, it is called as the Madrid Declaration. Now this Madrid Declaration of 1911, it was a very interesting declaration. It is a rule that governs rivers and lakes, and it says that you cannot alter one state without the consent of the other. You cannot alter the composition, or rather say redirect a river in any place you wanted without the consent of the other. Now this was basically a law passed to prevent other riparian states from using the river. Now this was a very interesting law. It was a progressive move at that point in time in 1911. And then finally, we have the next interesting piece of law that is called as the Geneva Convention of 1923. Now, Geneva Convention of 1923, Article 4, it says that a state may produce power from hydraulics. So, for the first time, they acknowledged the construction of an artificial man-made, infrastructure on the natural flow of river. What did they say? They say, quote and unquote, a state may produce power from hydraulics, and therefore it can also negotiate in order to have an agreement so that there is a proper execution that takes place and not a lot of harm is caused. So it was another very progressive step in terms of let's say production of electricity, energy, etc., whatever is there. But it was the first law which actually recognized the building of artificially built dams or hydraulics, etc., that is there. Now another piece of legislation which comes up is the Declaration of Montevideo. Now Declaration of Montevideo comes up in 1933. Now this is another interesting piece. It says that no state can actually alter international water course for industrial or agricultural exploitation. And why they can't do this? Because it will actually disrupt the riparian states, other riparian states' right. And if they have to do so, then they will take permission from that riparian state and also fairly compensate the damage that has been caused. Now this is another very interesting progressive piece of legislation that is there. Now what happens is we see that parallelly then in 1948 we come up with the Convention on Protection of Rhine. We start with coming up with many legislations which slowly started incorporating the element of exploiting water, but also at the same time making sure that no harm policy is actually caused to the other party, just because development cannot be stopped at this stage. They need to develop their own countries also. So they started balancing development and environment. So this whole concept of, let's say, 3 generation of rights that we have started coming into picture, and we saw a clear conflict of development versus environment coming into picture. Now when I teach my public international law class students, I tell them that there are 3 generation rights which we see. Number 1 is the first generation rights, where we are simply talking about civil and political rights, right to vote, right to live, right to have a personal liberty, etc., etc. All these basic civil political rights are usually called as first generation rights. We all know this because we all study public international law. Now, second generation rights are usually called those rights which are mostly related with economic, social issues, cultural issues, maybe. Let's say right to marry, right to have a family of its own, right against exploitation. Let's say freedom from, anything that you can think of. All these social, cultural rights which are there, they fall into the category of the third set of rights. Now, third set of rights, this is the third generation rights, are usually called as the right to environment, right to development for that matter, right to self-determination, which is a very big issue when it comes to Israel and Palestine, right? What Israel and Palestine is talking about, they're talking about right to self-determination, right? So all these are third generation rights, and now we are moving to fourth generation rights as per public international law. Now, when we see that, there is a gradual increase in environment versus development, this is taking place, we also see a blooming of many conventions, many treaties being signed. And similarly, in terms of water, very interesting convention comes up, and this convention is called as the Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes. Very interesting, convention that comes into picture. Now, this convention, apart from many other conventions that are there, is a very strong piece of document which talks about that we need to love our neighbor, we need to share, proper water allocation should be there, no harm should be caused to the neighbor with whom we are sharing the water, whatever it is there, etc., etc. There are many things that are there in this document. Parallelly, later on, what happens is there are a lot of people signing this convention, and finally the use and the administration of water actually exceeds the conventional ideas that we have. That is, earlier it was only for drinking water supply, maybe navigation, maybe irrigation, but now hydropower generation came into picture. Now many other use of water, even for that matter, water using of water for many other unaccountable things came into picture. So now this created a problem, how do you manage and how do you allocate water? For that purpose, what we had was, we started with the prompt development of water control treaties and convention. And this includes the best example, that is Helsinki Rules of 1966. Now, Helsinki Rules of 1966 actually united all these international water laws that were there, which were segregated regionally and were operating in silo. It attempted to, consolidify all of this under one head and try to speak about non-traditional uses of water that were there. Now, with all of this in context, we also came up with UNCLOS, that is United Nations Convention on Law of Sea, then Convention on Biodiversity, many other, 1960s, 70s saw a boom and mushrooming of all these laws that you can even imagine of. And India also played a very important role in all of this, whatever we are discussing. Right. So finally, what happened is that, all of these conventions that I'm talking about give up, they actually formed a way or a path for all of the countries to deliberate upon as to, what are we going to and how we are going to utilize water. Now, with this, one of the questions that, actually come to our mind is, okay, ma'am, we understand law, development, history, whatever it is there. But our basic question is, what are the legal principles that are being used to frame these laws, draft these laws, right? Because when we draft a law, we will have something in the back of mind, right? We need to understand that what is the natural basis, why did we come up with such piece that we are drafting today. So for example, the new IPC new criminal law revamp that happened, a lot of people said that these revamp is happening because we want to decolonize our laws, old laws, right? So what was the mooting point? The mooting point was, we need to decolonize it. A lot of people who are not in favor of the motion, they say that, in the name of decolonization, you just don't rename law. So again, I'm not going into the debate. These are two sides of the same coin that are there. Similarly, what happens is, when we draft a law, we need to understand what are the basis or what are the principles that we are recognizing why these particular laws are coming into picture. Now, when we saw mushrooming in 60s and 70s of water law coming into picture, international water law being framed, one thing was common. That common thing was either you're framing a regional treaty or you're having an international convention whatsoever. You need to pay attention to few principles. Now the question is, what are these principles? So these principles are very interesting principles of international water law. The first principle is called as the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization. Right. So the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization, it's a very founding stone of international water law. What does it say? It says that you need to fairly and reasonably utilize water. You need to put the consideration and need of all riparian states, even though there is upper riparian, downstream, lower riparian, whatever countries are there. You need to bring some harmony. How do you bring in harmony? By taking into consideration the need and interest of all the riparian states. And how do you do that? It says that you mandate the riparian states actually use the water very judiciously, fairly, not ruthlessly, right? So therefore, what is the principle here? The principle is the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization. And what does it help in? It helps in cooperation and prevention of any conflict that is there. So this is the first principle. Second principle. The second principle that whenever we adopt any treaty or agreement, we apply is the principle of no significant harm. Now, this principle is very interesting. This principle of no significant harm is a very interesting principle. It uses common water resources, and when you're using common water resources, it should not have a negative effect on the neighbor. What does it say? You can use common water resources because, of course, you're sharing boundary. Definitely, there will be some common water resources which you and your neighbor might be sharing. So, therefore, you should not have a negative effect on the neighbor while you are doing this, right? So, this principle is basically founded on the idea that you have a responsibility. And what is this responsibility? The responsibility is to safeguard other users, and you cannot just ruthlessly use whatever in whatever manner you wish to use. So this is the second principle that is there. Now we have the third principle. Third principle is a very interesting principle. This principle says the principle of cooperation. Again, very interesting. Now, principle of cooperation says that when the riparian states are there, they must work in consensus ad idem, in communitarian effort to handle their waters in accordance with the cooperative principles that is there. So what do you do to stop conflicts? You have to see active involvement of all the riparian states, and you need to maintain cooperation between the two states. So this is the third principle. Then you have a fourth principle. The fourth principle is called as the duty to notify and consult. Now this is very interesting because this is the most flouted principle when it comes to international water treaties that are there. So the duty to notify and consult, it says that the onus to notify and consult requires the riparian states to actually promptly and, let's say, meaningfully consult other riparian states. So let's say India and Pakistan, if today, let's say, Pakistan wants to build a dam, it should notify and consult India also, because the other riparian state involved here is definitely India. And this meaningful consultation should have been a planned action, and there should, it should impact the common water resources that are there. And how it is, what is the obligation? The obligation is you need to have some common knowledge. So for example, today if I'm starting with the plan, both the countries should have a common knowledge of it. There is no element of secrecy that is there. Now, when I say this is the most flouted principle, it's because usually the countries do not follow it. Then you have the fifth principle. Now, this fifth principle says duty to protect and preserve the ecosystem. Simple, that you have the duty to preserve and protect the ecosystem. Just because you're using water does not mean that you will completely ignore the existence of other species. The other principle is duty to cooperate in the management of droughts and floods. Now, this is a very interesting concept. Why? Because usually we see the swelling up of Brahmaputra, the swelling up of Indus River, the swelling up of Ganges, or the changing of course of water. Because we don't know, the river might change its course, and it might create a lot of impact on the other state that is there. So therefore, you have to duty to cooperate in such situations. Then lastly, you have the duty to manage the transboundary aquifers. Now, riparian states are actually, they are also obligated to manage the shared groundwater resources, right? Because groundwater tables are actually fulfilled, or they are actually responsible how the river and what quantity of water flows within the river. So this is how actually we see, the principles being followed in toto when we're talking about international water law. Now, very interestingly, let's say that, let's come to very interesting point, and rather I would say cases that have happened in under international regimes. So when we look at the international water law cases, and then when we come to a case study, very interestingly, we see that there are various codes that have dealt with the international water law. We see that, ranging from, let's say, permanent court of arbitrate, no, permanent court of international justice, from PCIJ to ICJ to regional courts. There have been various courts which have actually dealt with the cases relating to water law that is there, right? So now this is very interesting that we see. Can I just uh, be pardoned for 2 minutes? Yeah, because my cats are troubling me. I really need to throw them out of my room. I'm really sorry. Just give me 2 minutes. Yeah. I'm absolutely sorry. I apologize for the inconvenience in between. I'm really sorry. Again, animal rights. Yeah, so I had to go. Yeah, so when we're talking about water law cases, very interestingly, we'll see that, let's come to a let's say, an issue which influences all of us. That is, let's say, the issue between India and Pakistan. Now, one of the most interesting things that we see, and I don't know, it's beyond my scope to cover all treaties for that matter, because again, I told you it's a very exhaustive topic. But first, we'll see one or two cases at various forums, and then we could come to Indus Water Treaty per se. Now, when we see international water law that is there, we see that, the oldest case range from 1937, 1920s to even the latest one, which is going on in the ICJ, if you people are following international law news, between India and Pakistan. So India and Pakistan, the Indus Water Treaty, Pakistan had said that, we will take the matter to the ICJ. They've taken the matter to ICJ. India says that we will take the matter for a arbitrator or a mediator, and therefore, we should be allowed. And interestingly, we see that the World Bank has allowed both, because World Bank is the brokering, organization between India and Pakistan, which has actually brokered, or rather, let's say, which has actually been responsible for signing Indus Water Treaty. Now, they have given a green flag both to India and to Pakistan, and there are parallel proceedings that are taking place. Now, we are yet to see how this issue would be taken into account. It's a very interesting, thing to observe. Now, first, let's look into a few cases from international water law catalog. Now, we all know the oldest court that existed was the Permanent Court of International Justice that is there. Now, PCIJ has actually, decided for a very interesting case, which I also teach in my public international law case when I'm teaching sources of international law. This case is called as Netherlands versus Belgium. Now, this case that we are talking about, Netherlands versus Belgium, this case is also referred to as the diversion of water from Meuse case. Meuse is the name of the river, if I'm pronouncing it right. So, diversion of water from Meuse case is there, and Netherlands versus Belgium is the original name of the case. It was decided by PCIJ, that is Permanent Court of International Justice. Now, we all know Permanent Court of International Justice was formed in 1922 by an attempt of League of Nations, which actually later on failed. And later on, in 1946, we could rather say old wine in a new bottle. It is called as International Court of Justice, right? yeah, I'm just making it clear, or rather, let's say simple for you to understand. So in this case, what happened is Belgium and Netherlands arbitration happened, and it is one of the most important cases of PCIJ. And there was a lawsuit which involved Belgium diverting the water from River Meuse, and this caused a change in the river flow happening in Netherlands. Now this caused a lot of trouble to both of the countries, and in 1937 what happened was a treaty regarding Meuse's diversion of water and construction of canals for cultivation, transportation, etc., that was there between Belgium and Netherlands was under the question as far as the court was there. Now, what did the court decide is the court said that, the diversion of water that has happened, this actually must consider interest of both Netherlands and Belgium in order to uphold common water resources, right? But at the same time, what did the court say? The court said Belgium has to compensate Netherlands for the damage that is caused because of the water diversion. Why do they need to compensate? Because when you're using common pool of water, you need to have the consent of the neighboring party that is there. Now, when this judgment came, it established various important rules and principles of international water law. Like I just explained, number one, obligation to inform and consult, like the principle of no significant harm, like the principle of equitable utilization. So all these, for the first time, were recognized in this landmark case that I'm talking about. It's a very interesting, very important landmark case that I'm quoting here. Now let's come to ICJ. I'm just quoting one forum each and one important landmark each. So this was PCIJ in 1922. Now we'll come to 1947 when ICJ comes into picture. Now ICJ, of course, is UN's main court. Now you replace League of Nations by UN, replace PCIJ by ICJ, right? So now what happens is ICJ also, comes up with very interesting, cases that are there, and it also tries to solve such problems that I'm talking about. Now, one of the most important and most heard cases under public international law, you people might have definitely heard about this, is called as the Costa Rica versus Nicaragua. Now, this is called as the Costa Rica versus Nicaragua Order on Provisional Measures. This is a very interesting case. It talks about the construction of a road in Costa Rica along the San Juan River that is there. Now, this is a very interesting case. Why? Because again, for the first time, UNCLOS, that is United Nations Convention on Law of Sea, was used to understand the transboundary water treaties that are there and to interpret them. Now this is another very interesting judgment. In this, what happened is, although Costa Rica was very dissatisfied with the verdict, and Nicaragua was the one who actually won the case, but what happened here was the court found out that Costa Rica had a sovereignty over an island, and Nicaragua was actually disrupting the water flow, and it was causing a substantial transboundary harm to the other nation that is there. Here, what happened is Costa Rica and Nicaragua, after the case and the judgment was delivered, of course, one party is a judgment creditor, the other party is a judgment debtor. Finally, interestingly, we saw that it settled a lot of conflict. And how did the conflict settle? It understood that yes, we need to compensate, and we need to understand how amicably we can solve the problem. But then what happened is the ICJ suggested that you must enter into a agreement and therefore also mutually decide the case which is there. Now this also led to another very famous judgment of ICJ, which definitely you people would have heard about, is the pulp mills on River Uruguay, which is also called famously as the Argentina versus Uruguay case. Definitely you would have heard about it. So again, this is related to transboundary harm that is there. Similarly, you have the case of Costa Rica versus Nicaragua. This is regarding the dispute related to navigational rights. That is, navigation that takes place between two places that are there. So usually you'll find a lot of cases that are there very interestingly. But one thing we see very famously in all of these cases, the international water law jurisprudence has heavily relied on the courts to construe, interpret, and even evolve principles relating to water conflicts. And sadly, this has been the case also in India when we talk about interstate water disputes. So, if let's come back to India for that matter. If we see how environmental law actually established, or environmental law actually developed in India, we see a over stress, or let's say rather over reliance on the judiciary when it comes to environmental law. Now, when I make this comment, it's a very controversial comment that I'm making, but I'm also in a position to make this comment because a lot of us trace environmental law in India from 1972. A lot of us says that, ma'am, environmental law in India can only be traced back to 1972 because we signed the Stockholm Conference. And since we signed the Stockholm Conference, only after that there was an awareness of environmental rights which began. That's not actually the case. We have, as far as culture, religion, religious texts, etc., very much relevance or a say of environmental rights in all these documents that is there. But a lot of people with the colonial ideas, and not colonial ideas, rather to say, where people are influenced mostly by Western ideas, they believe that it was only the West when it knocked the door of India in 1972. And when we signed the Stockholm Conference, then yes, we actually, started really thinking about Indian environmental jurisprudence. So that is how we locate Indian environmental jurisprudence, that is 1972, as being the epoch-making event. And after that, we see that Mrs. Indira Gandhi represents India in the Stockholm Conference, come back to India, and then later on what happens is there's a flood of environmental laws that come up, be it Water Act, Air Act, 1986 Environmental Protection Act, so on and so forth. But one problem which has remained constant with us since our independence till today have been the controversial Indus Water Treaty. And I say it controversial, why? Because when we compare Indus Water Treaty with the Ganges Water Treaty, Ganges Water Treaty is the treaty signed between India and Bangladesh, right? That is relating to the Meghna Brahmaputra Ganges River Basin. And here we have Indus Water Treaty, which is regarding Indus water between India and Pakistan. You have two model treaties in front of you, and when you compare the treaty, be it in terms of drafting, be it in terms of legislation, be it in terms of international pressure, be it in terms of international commitment, be it in terms of politics, be it in terms of good neighbor policy, you'll see a drastic difference between Indus Water Treaty and Ganges Water Treaty. And that's why, hey, shoot. That's why we also say, move from here. That's why we also say Indus Water Treaty and Ganges Water Treaty, there is a remarkable difference that is there. So this remarkable difference also is because the stakeholders are different, the parties are different, the commitment and the motivation to fulfill are very different. Now, let's come back to what we actually started with, and let's focus more on that. So if we look at, rather, let us look at the water conflicts that are there between India and Pakistan, for that matter, if I say. So Indus Water Treaty was, signed somewhere, let's say, even before the independence, right? It was negotiated, talked about at that point in time. We saw that, India and Pakistan have been rivalries from the time of the Britishers, and Indus watershed became a very problematic issue for all of them. So what happened was, we saw that around, what do we call it? When we were negotiating this whole process, we saw that we needed a third party interference. Now, interestingly, the third party interference that came into picture here was the World Bank, because the World Bank said that, we need to negotiate this, and the Britishers also played a very important role by negotiating terms and conditions between India and Pakistan, bringing on table two enemy countries together and deciding on the distribution of water that is there. Now, Indus Water Treaty, very interestingly, when we look at and when we talk about, it has a lot of pitfalls that are there. It has a lot of issues that are there. Yet people say it's a very successful water treaty, one of the most historically successful water treaty that are there. Now, the biggest problem that I would rather say, and I urge you to read the Indus Water Treaty, is the dispute resolution mechanism, right? And the climate change element that is missing from the drafting of these treaties. Now, when you read the Indus Water Treaty and when you read the Ganges Water Treaty, you will come to one conclusion, that we're talking about water stress, we are talking about water allocation, we are giving preference to all these principles that I told you, we are giving preference to all these laws that are there, yet we are failing to minimize the conflict. Why so? We can safely say that we are able to minimize this conflict because of a very traditional approach to deciding water conflicts that are there. Now, what is the usual mechanism which we follow in the Indus Water Treaty is, let's assume there is a conflict, then you draft the stating of the nature of the conflict, right? First you draft what is the nature of the conflict. Now, once you're able to draft the nature of the conflict that are there, there will be regular meetings for conflict resolution by the riparian nations that are there, right? Now, this could actually lead to the formation of a river basin organization, we call it the RBO. Once the river basin organization is being established, then what it does is, usually the possible outcome would be mutual consultation, and this could either resolve the issue or unresolve the issue. Let's say it is resolved, very good, but usually this does not happen, it is unresolved. Then what happens is, then you will forward the conflict to an external platform. Who is the external platform here? The external platform here would be an international arbitrator. Perfectly fine. Now, the international arbitrator will have a session for hearing the concerned parties that are there, and then they will give a decision. Of course, you will have someone who will, against whom the decision will be passed, and rather, someone who will have a decision in favor of them. Now, this conflict resolution mechanism that I'm talking about, it's a very very cut copy paste mechanism of resolving international water treaties. You can see this model in Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan. You can see the same model in transboundary water treaty between Canada and US on Columbia River, between Jordan and Israel peace treaty on Jordan River and Yarmouk River. You can see the same thing in also Nile agreement that is there, and many other that is there on the Nile water, whatever it is there, right? So this is a very rudimentary, traditional, classical way of solving international water conflict that is there. Now, if you look at this from a structural point of view, you may see that the IJC that I'm talking about, that is the International Joint Commissioner, and the World Bank, it arbitrates the World Bank arbitrates, and the International Joint Commissioner comes into picture. They are comparable to the Indus Water Permanent Commission, right? And here the role is, very predominantly to be neutral, right? And when you talk about predominantly neutral, it causes a lot of problem. What people have been suggesting from a long period of time in Indus Water Treaty is, have a permanent dispute resolution mechanism. Don't make it as a reactionary policy, which it means to say that today I get hurt, I buy a bandit and put a bandit, tomorrow I throw away the bandit, I wait for myself to get hurt, again I go rush to the market, buy a bandit and put a bandit again. So one of the biggest issues with all these treaties that is there is, the dispute resolution mechanism is more or like a shift tent based policy, that today flood is coming, okay, we will compose this, we will have a dispute resolution structural body there, brokered by World Bank or any other agency, whatever it is there, and later on, when it would require. Now, this creates a lot of pendency, mistrust between the nation, especially like countries in India and Pakistan, it becomes a very big issue. So structurally, this issue of dispute resolution between the treaties is a big problem that is there. Second biggest issue or pitfall when we see about, or when we look into water sharing treaties between let's say India and Pakistan is, it actually if you look at the treaty and the failures of the treaty and also the appreciation of the treaty, one of the most important thing is, it misses out on the issue of climate change. And very interestingly, climate change has only become a very important issue only after a couple of small islands brought major developed nations to the court of law. Now, this is also called as the ICJ judgment on SIDS, Small Island Developing States, right? SIDS, Small Island Developing States. ICJ judgment on SIDS is there. Go to the ICJ website, you will find judgment there. And you'll also find the judgment of Vanuatu. Now, Vanuatu is a very small island. It brought major developing nations under question. And it said that, all these developed nations are doing industrial harm, environmental harm. Ruthlessly, they are using resources. And we, that is developing nations, in fact, small islands, are at the receiving ends. They are not even considering what is happening to us. And that is why, if you remember, how I begin the lecture is COP26. COP26 for the first time talked about loss and damage fund. It said very clearly, yes, we need to acknowledge that developing nations are doing some harm, definitely, for which they must be made accountable to. Now, these developing nations, developed nations, they say, yes, we are ready to compensate you. Now, this is a very laughable comment for a lot of reasons, because we saw how polluter pays principle in India became pollute and pay principle in India. So we saw the whole intention was to bring accountability and fixate the liability. But ultimately, what happens is that all of these, became excuse to, continuously use resources to, putting a blind eye to whatever is happening. So I really don't know what is the future of loss and damage fund. In the recent meeting, it has been discussed upon how they're yet to figure out how this fund would operate, how they're going to help the developing nations like you, me, Asian countries, and maybe help and support us in whatever possible ways. But let's see, we are yet to see that. Now, if we look at the pitfalls, when I was talking about the pitfalls, another pitfall, if I could safely point out, is the absence of, a supervision of an international guarantor who is there. Now, we all know that, when it comes to treaties and agreements, or for that matter, anything for that nature, these treaties, agreements are not deterrent in nature. And we have a very bad habit. If you will not attend the class, then your attendance will be taken off. So unless until there's a deterrent or a punishable element fixated to any agreement, treaty, sanction related to it, there is lack of motivation. Now you might say, ma'am, but India and Bangladesh is doing perfectly all right. How come that is not possible in India and Pakistan? The reason is there is a clear sense of motivation in India and Bangladesh. They are good neighbors for that matter, and they have been doing this. So the 1966 Treaty of India and Bangladesh, that is a Ganges Water Treaty, it is going to expire in 2026. I still believe it will be revised smoothly compared to the Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan, because of the committee, or let's say the mutual respect both the countries have for each other. So treaties like Indus Water Treaty, or whether you have conflicted nations that are there, you definitely require an international guarantor to play a role and also supervise that particular treaty. Now, in the Indus Water Treaty case, we have the World Bank. Now, recently, the World Bank has played a very, I would rather say, a very confusing role, because it gave a green flag to Pakistan to proceed with the parallel proceedings, and at the same time to India also. So let's see how things would turn up. But this is the last update as per my research that I saw in the Indus Water Treaty that is there. So this is there. And another very important issue when we look at the Indus Water Treaty as a problematic issue is that there is no sharing of regular data between India and Pakistan. When I say sharing of data, I'm talking about a no conflict resolution mechanism, whereby you have a third party guarantor. You also have access to transboundary let's say freshwater dispute database, which could be developed as it was developed by Oregon State University, maybe in the US. Maybe India and Pakistan can also think about it and have a freshwater dispute database, where we could actually see how much water is flowing, what is the state of allocation, whatever it is there. But all of this, because of the lack of collaboration and mutual trust, is again, it's a very bigger problem that is there. The last and the most biggest problem that I see, and this is the problem that I've seen when I was doing my PhD research also, is non-involvement of the beneficiaries. Now, what I'm saying about beneficiaries is, when I told you about riparian rights, I told you about upper stream, lower stream. Sometimes there are people who are living beside the river, right? And they are the direct stakeholders when it comes to being the beneficiary of the river. Now, if the river changes its course, definitely their livelihood, their shelter, whatever it is, there gets, badly affected. Now, the problem is all these treaties and agreements take place at a very bureaucratic, very beautiful international level, where we do not even have pilot projects, or where we do not even have consultation from the community within itself, who is actually the direct beneficiary, or rather, let's say, if not the beneficiary, they are the actual stakeholders of such treaties being brokered into. So this was one of the findings of my own research also, which we saw, that people were not communicated. Now, when I say people were not communicated, this brings very another interesting, question with your minds. What does communication means? Communication is not like the communication that happens in EIA. Now, what I'm trying to hint at, please try to understand. We all know there is something called as environmental impact assessment, right? Whenever any project has to come, whenever anything has to come, you need to have a EC, environmental clearance. Let's say today, in India, we need to have a project. We have three categories of project in India: project category A, B, and B2, right? State level, central level, some do not need any clearance whatsoever. So this is very much a part of your environmental law. I think you people might be knowing it. Now, this controversial EIA that I'm talking about, it requires one of the most important things, which is internationally settled principle. What is the internationally settled principle? The internationally settled principle, as far as Rio Declaration, many declarations and conventions are there. They say transparency, accountability, and right to information is the pillar stone of access to justice. We all know this, right? RS convention, many conventions are there. Now, when we're talking about EIA, whenever we are coming up with a new project, whatsoever it is there, we require public hearings. So, for example, let's say tomorrow the government of or the state of Tamil Nadu wants to come up with a project in outer part of Chennai, let's say in Kanchipuram, and there is a municipality or a panchayat, let's say in Kelambakam near Padur village. We need to consult the people of Padur village. Now, when I say public consultation and public hearing, this means in the vernacular language of the people. Now, for example, if I'm in industry, if I'm an MNC, if I'm someone at an international background, I go there, speak the terms and conditions in English, tata bye bye, you sign it, very good, clap it, and tomorrow there's a automatically you say a very big coke plant being constructed near your house, you're having breathing problem, etc. Then how does this actually gives right to access to justice? I don't even understand what I signed up to. So understanding the terms of condition in your own vernacular language is very important. Sadly, we see when environmental clearances are given, when EIA is done, people and public consultation and public hearings are not given much weightage. If they're given weightage, the people are not, the stakeholders are not involved properly. And if they're involved, they are not communicated in their own language. This creates a lot of problem. So now coming back to international law, what I was saying is, when we involve the beneficiaries, when we involve the stakeholders, here, let's say between India and Bangladesh, maybe you need to talk about the same in both Hindi language and Bangla language, and whatever languages the two countries are speaking. So vernacular language, public hearing, public consultation, beneficiaries, and community-led involvement, civil society involvement is also very important part and parcel, which we see not happening much when it comes to transboundary water sharing treaties that are there. I think I spoke a lot, and I would love to take questions. Yeah, I'm really sorry. Today my colleagues were saying, Nabila, your volume is so high, you don't need a mic. Yeah, apologies if I have been on the run, because I just wanted to. I'm saying whatever is there on the internet, but I would love to have questions. Nothing. I don't think I've said anything very special, but I've tried, because it's a very exhaustive topic. I would request next time if we could have taken a treaty by treaty. It would have been very interesting, because Indus Water Treaty is completely different from Ganges Water Treaty, and Ganges Water Treaty is completely different. How we see India and Nepal and India and China, everything is different. Yeah, but still, I would love to take questions. Yes, please. Yes, Himanshu.
Uh, Are there questions?
Yeah, you can just unmute yourself and raise your hand and start and ask questions. I would love to. Sir, we will share the Google form. First ask questions, Rajshri Patel. Yes. Anything. It could be related to any environmental issue that concerns your subject also.
Good evening, ma'am.
Yeah, good evening, Shivam. Yes, sir.
Ma'am, I have a question that what do you think that technology, what role can technology play in monitoring and in managing transboundary water resource dispute?
Okay, perfect. That's a very interesting question. Technology definitely have a say. So, okay. So when I was working on this particular issue of interstate water, interstate water dispute, interstate water distribution that is happening. One thing very interestingly I saw, and we also saw this is happening in IIT Kanpur, IIT Roorkee, IIT Kanpur, and IIT Madras is actually doing this, where they're actually using AI based platforms to create databases, and that's exactly what I was also talking about. So scientific sharing of data. Now, when we look at climate change as an issue, and very interestingly, you will see where there has been a rush of multiple climate change litigation very recently. India is not the India. We've just hinted, but globally there have been multiple climate change litigations that are happening, and slowly people are recognizing the need for having a climate change law and a policy altogether. So when we are brokering these treaties that are there, be it, let's say, the revision of India and Bangladesh treaty in 2026. So 2026, the India-Bangladesh Ganges Water Treaty is going to lapse. I definitely would urge India, being the pioneer of scientific development, should definitely place its course and have a mutual database or a technology database sharing device established between India and Bangladesh. Why it would help? It will help to monitor the water quantity, quality. One, of course, definitely water allocation. Third, mapping of climate change. Fourth, people like you and me, syllabus would be reduced. Why syllabus would be reduced? You would really don't have to fight a lot of climate change litigation. Litigation is expensive, especially when it comes to fighting with the companies. You will definitely would love to fight on behalf of a company rather than an activist environmental forum, right? That's the nature of any law student for that matter. But there have been landmark cases where we've seen very interesting international environmental lawyers, or international lawyers for that matter, doing great for the nation. So yeah, technology certainly have a role to play. And one of the clauses also, if I'm not wrong, in Indus Water Treaty says that definitely where this should be done. But sadly, India and Pakistan do not share its data relating to Indus Water Treaty, and that is why there's this lack of mutual trust and mutual collaboration which is there. I think it's a better in a better form. We can, if you really want to see a better, good, friendly nation relationship, I think India and Bangladesh is one classic example which we can look up to, definitely. But still, people say Indus Water Treaty is not a failed treaty. It is still surviving somehow. But yeah, that is another case that is there. Yes, sir. Yeah, Vedant. Yes, please.
Ma'am, Ramaswamy Iyer, who was the former secretary to the Water Resources in Government of India, has opined in a symposium that majorly the dispute resolution mechanism is based on international diplomacy and mutual consultation. And we know that India boycotted in 1997 UNGA abstained from voting
Absolutely.
in the UNGA meeting
Hmm.
on water convention.
Hmm.
So, ma'am, do you really think that adjudication is the way to go rather than mutual consultation or arbitration here, based on
Okay.
principles? Adjudication based on principles.
Adjudication based on principles. Okay. So this is a very interesting question. Adjudication based on principles happen only when both the countries are recognizing these principles. Now, one of the basic problems that I'll tell you, if you read Article 9 and annexures to the India Indus Water Treaty, very interestingly, you will see even the drafting of Indus Water Treaty requires a current change, and also at the same time a revamp of a few articles that are there. it has actually not recognized all the principles of international water law in toto in the Indus Water Treaty. And that is why when I was telling you all these principles, the reason why I was telling you is that it is an older treaty to in Ganges Water Treaty. Ganges Water Treaty was signed in 1966. It still attempted to recognize all these principles that I'm talking about, but Indus Water Treaty more or less does not recognize a lot of international water law principles. Why? Because it was more of a political document to bring into place India and Pakistan at a similar place, and also at the same time to make sure that they live in harmony and peace, and there is no water fight or a violent fight that is there. And that is why when we revise it, I pinpointedly suggested we definitely need to work on one area. What is that one area? That one area is dispute resolution mechanism. Why? Because the dispute resolution mechanism is the traditional dispute resolution mechanism which has been followed in many other countries, and it is now going to fall apart in the coming years to come, because now new challenges are coming before us. What are the new challenges? The new challenges is the water quantity is reducing, right? At the same time, Farakka Barrage was one important issue. Now we have gone ahead of Farakka Barrage in Bangladesh. We are talking about many more canals, man-made, barrages coming into picture. We are not now talking about security threats that are there. There are many issues that are there. So now it's the time to review the whole treaty from not only the perspective of international water law and committing to them, but also at the same time including new technological, innovative, and climate change policy issues, which definitely are right now not addressed in any treaty for that matter. So yes, I believe that adjudicating on principles is a good way to go about if you are following the principles. But on the plain reading of the document, something or something which we favor and we mostly opt for is a mediator based resolving of problem. Why do we do that? We trust that a neutral party would come into picture. But when India and Pakistan is there, this issue comes up. Even the recent one, if you just read the recent ICJ order, India says I don't trust the mediator, Pakistan says I also don't trust the mediator, or whatever the case may be, vice versa. We don't trust the neutrality of this particular arbitrator and mediator, whatever it is there. So therefore what we want to do is we want to go for a proper proceeding before the ICJ, right? So this is why both the mechanisms are mentioned in Indus Water Treaty. You can go for arbitrator mediator proceedings also. You can go for proceedings as per the ICJ also, as suggested, consented to by the brokering agency. That is the third party here is World Bank. Now, World Bank has played a very controversial role in this whole case. And I'm yet to see how this particular case turns out to be. But yes, I strongly advocate for mediation and arbitration because it is the best speedy mechanism whereby you can actually resolve a problem. If we go for adjudication based on principles, I think it could delay, but it is still another very important option to go about. It's a traditional good option, but if you're looking for speedy resolution, mediated and arbitration is a much better way. But does it fit within the Indian and Pakistan scenario? I doubt. So, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yes. Any more questions? Yes, Priyanshi Purohit. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, firstly, being from a legal background, as most of us are, I would like to ask, what are the career options in the field of environment?
Oh, wonderful. That's a very interesting question, though not related to the session, but okay. Yeah. So, what are the options that are there? So, one very interesting thing I'll quickly tell you is when it comes to environmental law, a lot of people, say that, ma'am, there are no attached procedural law. They're just teaching us environmental law. There are no. So, one thing you need to understand, you all have rules. We sadly, when we teach environmental law, in law schools, we only teach Environmental Protection Act. What about EP rules that are there? What about the procedural part that is there? Maybe NGT rules for that matter when you litigate in NGT. So definitely please stop seeing environmental law as a very theoretical subject where you get marks, you write the age-old Stockholm Conference of 1972 to Sustainable Development Goals ka definition and end of the story. No. Environmental law and international environmental law is doing and fetching you money that you can't even imagine. Now I'm talking about money because I know that's a very big very big factor for a lot of us, because we, at the end of the day, we don't want to sleep without food. So right to food comes into question. So how is it minting money? See, of course, there are various ways of seeing it. So number one would be as a litigator. Now when you're litigating, there are various think tanks, various forums, Vidhi for that matter, if I'm not wrong, CPR for that matter. Yesterday I was talking to a PhD master's student who recently worked at CPR, Center for Policy Research, for 2 years, and then he went on to go ahead for his master's study. And he was telling that, ma'am, my master's study became easier because I worked and I gained little knowledge of industry and I would understand law better. So sometimes all these require leading counsels. They require litigators to fight cases. So definitely you can offer a very good hand to these organizations that are there. Then definitely you have NGT as an option. So let's say you're fighting cases in civil, in subordinate case courts, and you're fighting cases in high courts. NGT comes as an addition to your, visiting card, that I also handle matters in NGT and,
Environmental science
matters
and
in
environment.
subordinate court and high courts also. So NGT is one area which people have not explored. Now they very recently, very interesting, one of the observations very recently was we need to have NGT in all states. I wish if we may have, I don't know what contribution it would make, but I wish maybe it could be a good experiment. But recently we have the principal bench in New Delhi and we have regional benches that are there. So even if you're regionally practicing, let's say you are in Chennai, you are in Pune, you are in Bengal, or you are in, let's say, the north, that is there, right? Or Bhopal for that matter, in central India. Then also you can take up matters relating to NGT because it offers an additional chance of minting money apart from your regular, civil or criminal cases or whatever you wish to do. That is one. Second is, if you're personally interested in working as a research assistant, you wish to do research, that could definitely be another option for sure. And I urge you to apply for LAMP fellowship. So there's a fellowship, it's called as the Legislative Assembly Member Parliament, some fellowship is there. L, capital A, capital M, and capital P, LAMP fellowship. Now, why is it helpful? It is helpful, like, for example, let's say you're very enthusiastic about the environment, but you do not want to be labeled as an activist, and you crack this LAMP fellowship, you are allotted a serving member of parliament. You are attached as a research assistant. Sometimes if they are also environmentally inclined, they might draft a bill, a private member bill, etc. You might do research for them. You can do anything, and you can also work as a research assistant in various other think tanks, legal organizations, etc. that are there. I know many successful cases where people have actually started this and they are doing wonders right now, which you can't even imagine. The other one would be mixing commercial laws with international environmental law. Now, this is very interesting because why I'm saying mixing commercial laws with international environmental law is because right now, I remember not a classmate, a friend of mine. He did his LLM from Leiden University back in that time, and I think 2018ish, and he completed his air and space law LLM. Now when matters come before him, we usually talk, and he says that people also now are very inclined towards fighting cases on the basis of greenwashing and the basis of environmental degradation happening in air and space areas. So there are multiple cases that are there. I don't know whether you've read about the recent judgment, that is the KLM Dutch judgment, which talks about greenwashing that is there. So it talked about how airlines was brought to the court of law because they, in their advertisement and their commercial advertisement, they said that we are the green airlines and zero carbon emission, etc., whatever it is there. And finally it was said that right to freedom of speech is there, advertisement is there. I'm just explaining you in Indian context is there. Okay, perfectly fine, but these are all symbolic promises. On data, on paper, we don't see you actually being zero carbon neutral or whatever it is. So therefore they were liable to compensate and stripe off all those advertisement and promises of which false promises they said. So like brainwashing, greenwashing, just promising, and at the end of the day it's nothing. So big companies get involved. In such cases you actually get a lot of opportunity. Why I say is because, God forbid, issues like Bhopal gas tragedy, I still in earlier lectures also I say, and today I repeat it again, We could have actually bargained with the foreign nations much better had we had good international lawyers at that point in time, or good lawyers who could understand international law, or play of words rather, I would say. Why I say this? They give us peanuts in dollars, which when we translate into Indian rupees, we say, oh my God, we've got so much money that is there. But that's actually pocket money for them. That was nothing. And what we faced is immediate, issues and proximate issues for generations to come. So to understand this, when you have a mixed idea of international trade law, international commercial law, and environmental law, I think definitely that works in your favor when you're litigating, practicing, or working as a research assistant. Now let's come to another perspective. You can, of course, if you wish to go ahead and teach, etc., etc., you can definitely become a professor that is another option that is there. Apart from that, what I am seeing recently, and that's one another very interesting area which you could explore, is that you can actually also work with, and I think now there's a, if I'm not wrong, there's a whole dedicated research unit coming up in Supreme Court. So a friend of mine, I don't remember, Rajesh Ranjan is a good friend. So he's working with Registrar Anurag Bhaskar. So there's a very new center for planning and research coming up in Supreme Court. So that is also taking up judicial clerks, etc. So that exam, and if you qualify that exam or work probably, and you express your interest, that could also be a bridging up gap towards you planning for an foreign and LLM, etc. If that is your aim and goal. And definitely, if you're opting for environmental law, definitely look for options in New Zealand and Australia. Why I say New Zealand and Australia? Because there's a lot of work going on in indigenous rights and rights of nature, etc., etc., whatever it is there. So you can definitely look for an LLM outside. That could also be an option. At the end of the day, if you have a very good background, please go for social activism. Yes, that I placed last because that comes with a lot of pressure in politics. Yeah. Yes, Shivam Singh. Yes, sir.
Ma'am, I have one more question. Ma'am,
Yeah,
suppose
please.
there is dispute between two countries and one country is not at all ready to negotiate with the other country. So can the international law force or bind that country to have a negotiation with other country to solve that water dispute?
Okay, first of all, what is the subject matter of the issue here? What does it concern? Like two countries are fighting on what?
Ma'am, water dispute. They have a water
Okay,
dispute.
water dispute. Okay. So first thing we need to understand, Shivam, here is international law. People say that it's the most non-implementable law, soft law, blah. That was the usual narrative people had, but that's not the case now. We are seeing a lot of things happening, be it internationally, whatever it is there. So when you sign a treaty and when you read the terms of the treaty, it depends on how you have reserved a special place for dispute resolution in your treaty that is there, and how you have formulated and what mechanism you're following for your dispute resolution. Now let's come up to an example. You're following whatever is mentioned in the treaty, both the country, but while this is going on, the other country stepped down. Okay, the other country stepped down. One clear answer is definitely you cannot provoke the other country. Definitely you can't put a pistol on the head and say that no sir, you have to agree with whatever it is there. But if this is creating an international issue, let's say it is causing a crisis within the whole area of India, Pakistan, that particular region, or whatever it is there, let's say this, then of course depending whether it comes within the jurisdiction of the ICJ, what kind of a matter it is there, what importance it does it hold, what potential that it has, you can definitely go ahead and urge the other party to at least sit together and sign, but you can force it, not possible. Now why I'm saying this is, for example, if you read about the Ukraine Russia war, so people are trying to draw parallel between Ukraine-Russia war and Israel-Palestine war. Definitely, there is no parallel. Both are different. Both are different. There is no parallel at all. Ukraine-Russia war is a classic example of preemptive measure of not doing harm. I feel that the other party can harm me, so I am harming you. Right? What is the logic of Russia behind the war on Ukraine? Preemptive measure. I feel I today I am sleeping and I'm dreaming that Ukraine will tomorrow come and shoot me. So therefore, in my dreams, I got this preemptive, this thing, and therefore preemptive action I'm taking. Now, preemptive action has become a reason or a rationale for people fighting. So, how do you stop people from not fighting is another very interesting issue that you've raised. So, definitely, we cannot actually force them, but there are sanctions under international law which you can definitely go about. But when both the parties have opted for, or rather, let's say they've signed the treaty, it is assumed that they will follow the treaty. Now, how do you make them follow the treaty? This is very interesting. This is where law is removed, politics and international relations and pressure come into picture. How do you do that? World Bank may threaten, I will not give you the money for brokering. Or probably, I'll extract the money from whatever it is there if you don't maintain peace, because money is involved. World Bank's money is involved in Indus Water Treaty. It's not only India and Pakistan who want to follow the treaty, but there are many international players who are begging, please, you follow the treaty. Not because of peace and harmony or environmental protection. It's because money is involved and a lot of stakeholders are involved. So that's why I'm saying the stakeholder here we are referring to, and the stakeholder I'm trying to refer to is completely different understanding of stakeholders. We are giving a lot of relevance to the economic stakeholders, but what about community-based stakeholders that are actually also influencing the problems? So brokering, especially the case of Indus Water Treaty, when it comes to World Bank, it is very cautious, it is very mindful, and that is why it makes sure that this treaty continues no matter what, because that's the only possible solution. So that is why they jiggle the ball today in your court, today in Pakistan's court. So money is involved. Yeah, of course it will. I am saying definitely another 50 years you might see it would run. You might hate each other, but it would run definitely. Yeah.
Thank
Priyanshi
you.
Jain. Yes. Thank you, sir.
A very good evening, ma'am.
Good evening. Yes.
Ma'am, I have this question that recently the Supreme Court had announced that we have a fundamental right against the right to be free from adverse effects of climate change. And earlier, when PIL used to be filed against the normal fundamental right to clean environment under Article 21, there used to be a very difficulty in assigning the liabilities on the parties involved in the conflict. Like Supreme Court used to do, Supreme Court or any court of law used to though use certain principles, but still the liability was always into question. And now, after this newly climate action litigation coming into play, now since we do not have any climate policy or any climate law at present with India, so how the liabilities and responsibilities will be determined by this climate action litigation coming into play after this judgment?
Okay. So what I understood your question is it has some connection relating to the recent judgment, right?
Yes.
So the recent judgment, what I read and what I understood is it's a very interesting judgment for a lot of reasons. So a lot of people have written very recently on this judgment. A lot of people are saying it's a very promise move, whereby we have expanded Article 21 to include beyond right to safeguarding the environment and going ahead by talking about right against climate, what do you call it here? I forget. Right against climate change that is there, and protection against the climate change, whatever it is happening, right? Although the judgment was based around, or it started with the protection of great Indian bustard, which is a species of which is a particular species falling within the flora and fauna. It had nothing to do with climate change prima facie. If you read the case, it started with the species being the subject matter. Then we go ahead with it being endangered, etc., and so on. Cables being led, environmental, environment versus development coming into picture. So many conflicts happening, man and or let's say human and animal conflict, or human and nature conflict. Many concepts came, etc. And finally we decided on something else. So we started with plucking of the ear and we ended with plucking of the nose. So that's how the judgment is. It's a very progressive judgment, definitely. Now, how do you see it? When you're talking about liability, what I understood from your perspective, you're talking about the liability, or fixation of the liability about the species that you're talking about, if I understood it right. Now, if you're talking about fixation of liabilities when it comes to human and animal conflict, very interestingly, I think in a few other lectures also I was talking about, there's a concept of rights of nature that is being discussed widely. Now, widely we are saying that, all these animals, rivers, whatever it is, that confer them right? So a lot of people are saying confer them right, treat them as legal personality, treat them as a person. So for example, in your jurisprudence first year chapter, when we study, we talk about rights of unborn child, right of a corpse, whether corpse is a legal personality, does it have a legal personality or not, whatever, etc., etc. It's a basic chapter, basic jurisprudence chapter that is there. Now, one thing we see, and very interestingly, we are seeing it in India also. In India, you had Salim versus State of Uttarakhand, if I'm not wrong. There was a judgment, very interesting, in which they talk about giving rights of nature or recognizing river Ganges as a personality, as a legal personality. Okay, perfectly fine. Later on, challenged before the Supreme Court, and there are multiple petitions on this issue, and we are yet to see any remarkable landmark judgment of right to nature yet. But this was again a very important opportunity where they could have said the rights of animals, because there are a lot of people who are talking about animal rights also, right? So when they're talking about animal rights, they're saying that please give animals certain rights and recognize them as legal personality. Now, when you're fixating the liability, or when you're talking about giving them legal personality, you're also giving them two rights. What are the two rights when you say that they are legal personality? Right to sue and right to be sued. Definitely tomorrow, if you harm a great Indian bustard, you harm a tiger, or you harm river Ganges, they will appear before the court of law, and they will argue that yes, this particular person has whatever it is, through the council or whatever it is. Right now the question is, this rights of nature movement that is happening globally started with New Zealand and Australia, and it started with river Wangui. Then we saw many other nations also copying this concept, and later on they also developed their own jurisprudence. Now slowly this talk is now started in India also. In India, there have been judgments where we've talked about legal personality of idols, right? Idols that we worship, right? And it has talked about legal personality of various other things, but we are yet to have a fixated liability model or legal personality being guaranteed into any non-human species that we are talking about. We are yet to do that. Now, when I'm talking about non-human species, I'm including river, I'm including animals, I'm including even plants for that matter. So recently what we are seeing is, even recently Philippines has given whales as legal personality, because they say that if you keep harming the whales and kill them, then the ocean biology, whatever it is getting disturbed. The only way to preserve them is by giving them rights of nature. Now, this great Indian bustard case which you talked about, and when we give them legal personality, this also has a lot of problems. It's not a very bed of roses that we are talking about. When you're giving something legal personality, you need to understand who shall be its guardian. You need to understand how and in what manner are we going to fight the case, right? How you're going to proceed before the court of law. Let's say tomorrow, river Ganges is given right to, it has a legal personality. But let's say because of a lot of rain, the river gets swollen. It changes its path, right? And because of this, let's say 100 people are killed because it changed its path, right? Now, since it changed its path, 100 people are killed. Will you actually file a case against the river? Will you kill the river, or will you penalize the river Ganga? That's a very big question, because right to sue and right to be sued also includes the other way around. So how would you proceed? So it's a very complex issue that I have, though I'm in favor of rights of nature, because that's one way where we can actually guarantee a lot of animal rights, etc. But how do people understand it? People take it, and how do nature plays out in the court of law? That is, quoting the nature in the court is again a very interesting thing that we would like to see. So yeah, let's see. I don't know what future it holds. Maybe tomorrow we can have rights of nature being talked about in the court of law. Yeah, definitely. That would definitely help in fixating the liability as far as the animals and this thing. Yes, Biswajit Ghosh sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Namila ma'am, I
Yes,
am
sir.
Bishwajit from Bangladesh. I'm
Yes,
a
sir.
lecturer of Green University of Bangladesh.
Yes. Yes,
So
sir.
I have two questions for you.
Yes, sir.
First one is, we all know that in 2026, the Ganges Water Treaty will be expired. And there are mostly 54 rivers that are coming in from India to Bangladesh.
Absolutely.
So will it be better for the both countries to talk about all the rivers rather than only talking about Ganges, because we can see there are Tista barrage and Tipaimukh barrage, and Tista river is almost dead because of the barrage. And the second question I have for you is right of nature movement. This basically does not only mean that right to be sued and right one can sue and one can be sued. It also means that there will be a legal guardian for the river as well. And in Bangladesh, there is a case of Turag River case, and the High Court division has said that NRCC as the legal guardian. So, won't it be better that two legal guardians in two different countries, they can come up together and settle the issues?
Okay, very interesting. Okay, that the last question is very interesting. Okay, so first we'll take into consideration your first question. So first question, you are trying to talk about the brokering or revisiting of the Ganges Water Treaty between India and Bangladesh. Yes, so India and Bangladesh has signed the Ganges Water Treaty in 1966. Now 2026 is going to lapse, right? Now when it will lapse, one thing is for sure that we need to see is when we revisit the treaty, we definitely need to advocate for a strong river based organization, or RBO, that rather we would call river basin organization. Now why we are saying that is because when you look at the SDG goals and when you look at the sustainable development goals, even when you align the treaty with sustainable development goals, you will see that one of the goals is the right to clean environment and right to water. So right to water, or clean water rather to say, is one of the most important goals in sustainable development goals. In that particular portion, you will see that there is something called as IWRM. IWRM is integrated water management, right? Integrated water resource management, that is there. Now, integrated water resource management in the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 says promote for stronger river basin organizations. Now, what does this river basin organizations would do? River basin organizations, when they are very strongly, let's say formulated, then what happens is it will look into three conjunction of rivers, which you rightly pointed out in case of India and Bangladesh is the GBM basin. That is the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna basin. And why this is important, and it's a very put up question when we address in today's era, is because the obsession is only about river Ganges or river Brahmaputra for that matter, right? We completely ignore the fact of the tributaries that are there. And the basin, when we are talking about India and Bangladesh being a lower riparian region and also being at the receiving end when it comes to flooding, changing of river courses, it has faced a lot of adversity also that is there. But when we are talking about the revision in 2026, I think the most important thing that we need to reconsider right now, as per the third poll. So there were 2-3 articles in third poll, if you could read the third poll articles that is there, and few articles in EPW, Economic Political Weekly, where people have pointed out, I'll name a few writers that are there, which includes McCarthy also. So, and there are various very interesting, writers from Bangladesh who have actually appreciated the treaty for being very strong, mutually committed. But one thing still which we lack is, as you rightly pointed out, is the consideration of tributaries that are there. A strong river basin organization that is there. A permanent dispute resolution mechanism it is there, which in the case of India and Bangladesh is most unlikely, because in India, Bangladesh, we've not seen conflicts on basis of mutual, distrust, etc. that is there. So this is very interesting to see, and it would be very well committed to SDG goals if we could fixate or come up with a strong river basin organization, a very structurally profound dispute resolution mechanism per se, and most probably also, look into these considerations that you're talking about. Now, coming to your second question, where you're talking about, it does not merely includes right to sue and right to be sued. It also includes, fixating of the guardian. In this case, when you look at the Bangladesh judgment, the judgment from your High Court, it was a very interesting judgment. I did get a chance to read it, and very profoundly, very interestingly, they were able to fixate the guardianship that is there of the entity that is under question. But when it comes to India, the problem becomes a little complex. Now, when I'm saying a little complex, I'll tell you why. Because of the socio-cultural fabric that is there. Now, we treat few rivers as god and goddesses. So we attribute a lot of religious what do you call emotions and sentiments to the river, right? So there are a batch of people who are definitely pro rights of nature, but there are a batch of people who are not comfortable with rights of nature being a solution to preventing pollution in the river. So for example, for a lot of people in the religious ceremony, when people die, they they keep their after burning the pyre, what they do is they flew it in the river that is there, river Ganges that is there. For a lot of people, it could be something which is maybe somewhat damaging water. I shouldn't say this, but some people could say this. The other lot would say that my religious sentiment are attached with this river. So again, in India, Article 25, that is right to religion, versus Article 21, that is the right to environment that we're talking about, closely comes into conflict with each other. And this is a lot of cases that I would talk about. If there had been a lot of time, we could have discussed about. So you are right. Yes, rights of nature has been very potential, but how it would work out in India is again little problematic. I'm not saying it's impossible, it's a positive move, but how the court would intertwine the thread and finally come up with an operation is very interesting to see. And I would say, for religion purposes, let's say right to religion, court in India came up with the ERP test, which Bangladeshi courts have actually taken or borrowed from India. That is the essential religious practices test. Maybe right for nature also, Indian courts could come up with certain doctrine, certain harmonious construction principle, certain balancing act where we could also balance the interest of the religious sentiments by rights of nature, also civil society, pollution, international commitment, all together served in a similar basket. Now you ended the question by saying that we could have two countries having a common guardian or maybe separate guardians and looking over that particular river. Definitely that could be done, not an issue at all. But now my question is, so tomorrow when we do this, then the treaty has to be brokered under their name since they are the guardians, right? That is one thing. And anything and everything that happens between these two countries in the name of fixation of liability, don't you think then these two people will be brought before the court of law, or maybe would be the contesting parties tomorrow? And I think it creates a little bit more tricky position rather than solving the problem in this particular case. So the main motive behind rights of nature in New Zealand, Australia was to conserve the nature, conserve the rights of the indigenous people and therefore also the river. But it becomes problematic when more than countries involved. How countries view that particular river, what relevance it has in their own life. So let's say for people of a different state, that particular river might mean nothing, but for a particular state, that river might be a god and goddess. So agreed what you're trying to say, I totally completely agree with you. Yes, it's not merely right to sue and to be sued, it also includes right of appointment of guardianship. But how do you go about? I advocate for rights of nature, but how would you go about is a very I don't know, I am yet to understand how it would go about in the case of India. We do not have any precedent to look up to, unlike Bangladesh, where we could actually comment on the jurisprudence. But yeah, if that makes any sense to you, Biswajit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Ma'am, we have questions. We have 5 questions from 2 peoples. I guess there is paucity of time. If you could permit us, we may ask your question by mailing you the
So the
questions.
thing is, I can take one question last, because the biggest problem is I have a meeting scheduled after this, because I thought we have it till 7:30. I'm really
Yes.
sorry. I would love to. I would have loved to take all the
So-
5 questions. Can you just prioritize one question? It's up to you. Up to you. And write others. What you could do is you write to me. I will definitely write back answering whatever is required, because I'm very much, I love spamming people over email. So I will definitely respond to all your emails, but prioritize one question and then probably we can take that up.
So we have one question, which is,
Yes.
how does indigenous communities and marginalized population influence or are affected by transboundary
water disputes, especially in context of shifting weather patterns and extreme event. In addition to that, I will add, is there any national policy related to these communities?
Okay. I think this is what we've been talking around since long. Okay. Anyways, does it influence? Definitely it does influence. How does it influence? Yes. Climate changing pattern and weather definitely influences the indigenous community that is there. Now let me give you a very quick example and then we'll go back here. So you have something called as the Gardasil Committee report. I don't know whether you people have read it or any reference made to it. Please do read something called as the Gardasil Committee report, GADGIL. So Gardasil Committee report talks about the condition of Western Ghats, eco-fragile regions, etc., etc., whatever it is there. Right. So it categorizes certain region on Western Ghats, that is the area of Maharashtra, etc., as eco-fragile. Eco-fragile means you cannot have any project taking place there or any disruption, any development activities. It will cause a disruption. So Gardasil Committee report came and it created a lot of ripple effect in the legal and the public policy community. Why they started saying that, Western Ghats, people never imagined Western Ghats had eco-fragile regions. We have eco-fragile regions in Kerala. We have eco-fragile regions in Maharashtra, right? And that is how we see whenever it rains very heavy or whenever there is flood, Kerala, Maharashtra, certain places, especially Kerala for that matter, it faces a lot of problem, right? So there are umpteen number of reports that are there, and one classic report is Gardasil Committee report that we are talking about. So they have given us very interesting, beautiful evidences where they say that, you need to understand that certain regions are eco-fragile. Now, has that stopped people from coming up with industries or, development projects? No, not at all. So, for example, Wayanad advocates for having ecotourism. But at the same time, there are few projects that are coming up in Wayanad also, which is quarrying project. Quarrying means you're taking away minerals and marbles, etc., from that particular place, whatever it is there, right? Or cutting of forests and trees that is there. So there are quarrying projects happening in Dehradun also, eco-fragile region. I don't know whether you people are aware or not. Uttarakhand, whatever we saw, classic example of man-made destruction. I don't call it natural destruction. I call it man-made destruction. Why I'm calling man-made destruction? There have always been many reports and documents which have reflected they are strictly eco-fragile region. Now we are very happy. Oh, one more tunnel is, made. Very good. We can reach to now Leh Ladakh. We can go to here. We can go to there. Now bike rides are easy, etc. But my question is, at what cost? That's a very big question that is there. Now, how does this influence indigenous community, etc., that we are talking about? Classic example is, take example of Odisha. Take example of Tamil Nadu, that is there. Take example of Kerala. How does it influence the fishermen community? Now, the fishermen community are the very important. They are not indigenous community per se, but they are one of the stakeholders, one of the most important, stakeholders when it comes to all these issues that we are talking about. When we are talking about issues relating to CRZ, coastal regulation zones that are there, when we are talking about floods that are there, when we are talking about disasters that are there, these communities play a very important role. How do they play an important role? They play an important role in resilience. They don't need law and policy. Just because of the community feeling, they come together forward and they fight back against whatever issues that are there, and they resilient, and they say that yes, we will rise again from whatever issues that are there. And then government recognize heroes, give packages, whatever it is there. But now the problem is, let's come to indigenous community which you're talking about. Classic example is the mountain of Dongri Kund, somewhere in Chhattisgarh. So in Chhattisgarh, there is a mountain, it is called as Dongri Kund. The people or the tribal people there, they worship the mountain. Rights of nature, we can bring back here again. It's a Naxal prone area. They say, the state says it is a very bauxite rich region, Chhattisgarh. We need to have bauxite. We need to mine bauxite. Absolutely fine. No one is saying development industry, definitely +1. We should go for it. But these people worship the trees there. These people worship the mountain there. They say that this is our God, right? And you cannot do mining. You cannot take bauxite from here no matter what happens, right? And we cannot let it go. Now, here what happens is, instead of human versus animal conflict, it becomes an indigenous community versus a state conflict. And then it becomes very controversial because A lot of places where we have seen the state also has gone to the extent of using violence. I'm not saying not always, but the state has sometimes used very heavy measures to, curb certain voices so that industries could, usually, I'm not blaming, I'm not pinpointing any government for that matter, but I'm saying sometimes this has also very crazily happened where we've seen such cases. Classic cases of Sterlite case in Tamil Nadu. There was a place called Tuttugudi. So Tuttugudi in Tamil Nadu, same case. Sterlite is a very famous, well-known company. It established its operation in Tuttugudi. People started protesting. No, whatever it is there, the local people, the indigenous people, or the community people that are there, they did not agree with whatever was happening and they protested. Finally, there was firing that happened, etc., etc., and there was a state sponsored suppression of that movement or protest, whatever we call it, and around 5 to 8 people lost their lives. Now, how do you see it? I'm opening it for your interpretation. I'm not giving any comments here, but as per the news reading, whatever it is there, I'm telling you about that. So it's a very controversial issues when it comes to indigenous community and right of these people, because you recognize them, you acknowledge them, you say they are stakeholders, but at the same time, their understanding of nature versus your understanding of exploitation of nature is very different. It's very peculiar, very different, very interesting, and that is why I'm saying look at the parallels with New Zealand and Australia. In New Zealand and Australia, you see, especially in New Zealand, there's a community called as Maori community, right? Maori community, the community which has tattoos, usually you might have seen. You have serving MPs who have the tattoos, etc. These are the indigenous community of New Zealand. They're serving MPs. There's a whole center dedicated to Maori community. There are languages, recognition of them, whatever it is there. So unless until we involve them in the process, they will definitely have anti-state feelings. They will not understand, because we need to form a midway. See, we cannot completely ignore them also at the same time that, indigenous community should not be brought at play at all because they don't understand. No, you need to bring them at the table to negotiate, to bargain, and to understand like a child, like whatever it is, because they are stakeholders. But at the same time, we also need to understand the kind of pressure we have on natural resources, as the state is the guardian of the natural resources as per the general jurisprudence that we understand. Now, how do you strike a balance? You strike a balance by having public hearings, by having their local language being understood, communicated, talked about, and projects and whatever. We call this process a trust building process. So you need to have a trust building process. You just don't knock the door one day and say, oh, today I have come to take your bauxite away. I don't care, you worship Dongri Kund or whatever it is. I don't know, because I don't understand your language and I am a suited, booted man. I have the full right to, do whatever it is. Then you are actually repeating the history. You're actually doing what? You are doing exactly what the Western colonizers did. You're colonizing your own people, right? It's a very strong statement that I'm making. I don't know what remarks it or what consequences it has, but again, it's like the exact comparison of white man's burden theory that you're looking here. Now the colonizer is not white man, the colonizer is you and me, right? We are putting again, so they're our own people. We need to make them understand, we need to negotiate with them, we need to understand, we need to bring them on table, and also have a better law policy frame that is there. So that's what I'm trying to say here. All these things are on record, so yeah, I was just trying to make it as simple as that. Yeah, because see, as a teacher, as someone who's teaching social science, we are debarred from, and I would say why I'm using a strong word, debarred. We should not be opinionated. When I'm saying we should not be opinionated, when I'm coming with the opinion in the class, I am completely disacknowledging or not acknowledging the opinion or the ideas of any other student who would have a different idea altogether. So my idea is to expose you to both the sides, the state side or maybe the community side. Now it's up to you. How do you understand and which side you choose as an advocate to probably, litigate for a particular set of rights that are there. So I usually, whenever I teach in class, my whole attempt is to always expose to both sides of, whatever it is there. Yes, traditional knowledge by that's a very interesting topic. maybe someday we can take that. I'm really sorry, it's almost going to be 8. I'm really sorry. I have a meeting and I need to cook also. I please remove that from the recording this thing. Yeah.
Sure, ma'am. So
Yeah.
I guess we can move to formal closing of
Yeah,
this
please go
session.
ahead, please.
Padmaja?
So, as we move on to wrapping up the session, I, on the behalf of the center, deeply appreciate and thank ma'am for dedicating a precious time to for sharing her knowledge in today's session and answering all the questions patiently. Lastly, thanks to all the attendees who patiently listened and also asked thoughtful questions. And in all, thanks to all of them for their active participation. And once again, thank you everyone. And over to Hemant, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am, once again. And
Thank you so much.
we
Yes.
had great opportunity while you were here, but you love South more than DNLU.
I really, I'm very happy to see, because I worked at DNLU for a year and then I left from DNLU, and DNLU is doing really great. I'm really proud of my students, maybe who have passed and who are still studying there. Really proud of it. And I was an assistant warden also there, so I spent some really great time at DNLU. I wish the best to DNLU students and also other people who've joined, definitely. And I'm really happy for one thing: you did not have the session in the proper Indian manner that you have. Okay, good morning, good evening, because it's see, we need to move out of it. Directly come, let's welcome, have the topic, because we all have time constraints, so that's how it is supposed to be. Let's not go into that. Yeah, whatever it is. Very good. Okay, thank you so much,
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Himanshu. And
Hemant.
Hemant, I'm really sorry. Thank you so much, Hemant, and all the organizers for giving me an opportunity. Would love to connect with you all again, and definitely we can, have other sessions in the coming future. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Ma'am,
ma'am.
Thank
sorry
you,
for
ma'am.
disturb. I have just one question. As an I'm an atmospheric science researcher, can I get your email for any communication purpose?
Uh, Shanu sir, you can message us or mail us. We'll send ID to you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.